He was previously UK Secretary of State for Business Innovation Skills and President of the Board of Trade, but he's also a properly trained economist who I believe worked at Chatham House in the 90s, 80s and 90s, I think.
I did a stint at Chatham House, yeah, and I think rather more at Shell. I was the chief economist, and that's how I really partly got into China, actually. I was sent out by Shell to do some scoping around whether they should make a billion investment, and I was there to do the risk assessment, and got me into China. I'd done a lot of work on India before, but I thought that was, I began to get seriously interested in how do you make a comparison between these two superpowers, and that's what triggered it.
Brilliant. Well, look, I thought what would be good, because actually China and India are not often compared in great detail. It's a bit of an anomaly, comparative work on them. And obviously you have a very big interest in India, but also you've kind of written quite a lot about China in recent years, in the past. So I suppose to sort of kind of really kick things off, we saw sort of Prime Minister Modi with Xi Jinping at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization last month. They seem to be kind of getting on okay at the moment. What do you think are the key things that we need to look at in this massive relationship, which sort of looks on the surface at the moment okay, but is probably pretty complicated underneath? What are the things we need to really track?
Well, before answering that, just why I find this comparison interesting. Basically, you've got two countries which currently have virtually identical population, and they're a different scale from anywhere else in the world. They also started off as a key turning point, 1947-48, with virtually identical per capita incomes, to the extent to which you can measure it. And they've had a very different trajectory since. So there's an interesting question from development point of view, how and why have they developed the way they have? And if you look future, around about 2050, on most plausible assumptions, and I say plausible, you can't predict the future, these will be the two biggest economies in the world, with all that goes with that, military capacity, soft power, and so on. But in terms of the relationship between them, it's been remarkably little, actually. I mean, given that they're so massive economically, there's relatively little trade, there's relatively little political interaction, and there was a war, small war, 1962, which the Chinese won comprehensively and then went back. And then there was I suppose it amounts to a scuffle. It was a strange kind of Stone Age battle between people with sticks and stones. Quite a few were killed, but this was several years ago. So there is this history of aggro around the frontier, which is very long and contested, and arguably is what really defines the relationship. Certainly when I was last in India about last year, talking to all the geopolitics guys, insecurity and suspicion about China dominated their thinking. And from an Indian perspective, they basically saw China as the big challenge for them. And that slowly over time has drawn them into this security relationship with the United States, Australia, and Japan. And they don't use the word enemy, but suspicion is a word that's very prominent. What I describe in the book, the phrase I use is frenemies, because there is conflict, actual and potential, but there is also a lot of common ground on certain issues. There is a mutual interest in trade, the Indians getting access to Chinese technology and investment. There is a common position on kind of what you might call broadly north-south issues. Again, with qualification, both of them have signed up to the de-dollarization initiatives of the BRICS. Both of them have a virtually identical position on climate change and COP, which they will in a few years' time tend to dominate because they will be the two biggest emitters. China already is by a long way, and it is both, in both cases, a recognition that climate change is a massive threat to both of them. They can already see the impacts of it. They're both trying to develop a long-term strategy of diversification into renewable energy, most obviously in China's case, but India's moving very fast as well. And they both need, in the short term, to protect their coal industry from the threat of Western environmentalists, which is the way they tend to see it. So there are quite major elements of common ground. And relating directly to your question, I mean, what triggered the meeting with Xi and Modi was, of course, the very crass moves that the Americans are making, which was not just imposing tariffs, but which are very sensitive to India's fairly limited manufacturing exports, but had a big impact on them. You had Trump cultivating Field Marshal Munir, I think he's called, as the head of the armed services in Pakistan, allegedly because Field Marshal Munir was willing to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. And then on top of everything else, you've now got the restrictions, or threatened restrictions, on visas for high-skill, highly trained Indians, which is a major issue for the educated Indian middle class, who, very much of which is much of the diaspora is in the United States. So all of those things combine to constitute a major snub to the Indian Prime Minister, who had been assiduously cultivated by Trump when he was first in power. And going off to see Xi Jinping was, I think, a gesture, well, don't take us for granted.
So, just sort of talking about the geopolitics a little bit more. China is, obviously a kind of problematic partner for many now. India is seen sometimes as a counterbalance. From what you've said, though, it's not a straightforward counterbalance. In terms of putting production in India, in making India part of the Indo-Pacific, I mean, all these things, is that going to be straightforward, do you think? Is that really going to lead to an India which is the sort of great balancer for China in the 21st century?
Well, a lot of people in the West want to, I think, put it in one of the scenarios which I sketch out in the final chapter. I have 3 scenario stories about the long-term future. And one of them is what I call the global West. And this is, in fact, India being co-opted into an alliance. I think that was in the Biden era. That was very much how people like Sullivan saw the world. And India would be bound in through defense relationships. But it's complicated in all kind of ways. That, of course, first of all, India is very protectionist, much more than China. China is a more open economy in many ways, despite being very mercantilist in the way policies operated. The Indian foreign policy establishment is very touchy about, it values respect for what it now calls its multi-alignment, not quite non-alignment, but multi-alignment. And so a reluctance to be co-opted too crudely into a Western alliance, but nonetheless with that security element beneath the surface. And one of the, I think, interesting side stories, and I tend to look at the world through economic issues rather than the politics of it, but one of the interesting structures which is developing is the CGTBP in Asia Pacific. Britain is a member of it. And you would have thought that India would want to be part of these pan-Asian trade agreements. I mean, another one is the RCEP, which China is a member of, but the Indians back out of these because they worry about the political impact of opening themselves too freely to trade in competing agricultural products and manufacturers. And this process of decoupling, by companies like Apple, detaching itself from China and investing in India, it's proving actually quite problematic. India has many very successful entrepreneurs, very good export industries, but they mostly centered on the service sector and information technology. Manufacturing export has not been a great strength in India. So there isn't the kind of worker discipline. Things like trade unions, which are a bit awkward, a strong resistance in Tamil Nadu, for example, to having women in dormitories. That it didn't go with the kind of Indian way of doing things. So a big contrast with what I saw in China. I mean, I think on my last ministerial visit, I was taken to the big Foxconn complex. You may well have been there, so several 100,000 employees. And I asked about these nets that are suspended between the various buildings, and my Chinese interlocutor explained very frankly that to stop the workers throwing themselves out of the window, because worker conditions, well, very much improved now, but were harsh. And that kind of thing you can't do in India. And that's partly why the process of simply transplanting a supply chain from China to India just doesn't work.
I remember about 12 or 13 years ago when I was based in Sydney, an American trade negotiator said at the time, whenever India enters a trade agreement, it degrades the agreement. It kind of reduces its value. Is that true?
Yes. In fact, the collapse of the last multilateral trade agreement, 2008, Doha round, there were fingers pointed at a lot of people, but the most convincing fingers were pointed at a man who was nicknamed Dr. No, who was the Indian trade negotiator. And, there were all kind of problems. The Americans were already heading in a more protectionist direction and more skeptical about the World Trade Organization, and there were others too. But India's protectionist instincts are quite well embedded and have created all kind of problems for opening up Asian markets.
On technology, so I think, again, in the past, people would have taken Chinese technology ability Indian technology ability quite high. They would have kind of felt it was pretty strong. And now it seems like China is really pulling ahead. I mean, it's putting massive amounts of investment into research and development. It's producing its own sort of free to download, AI app, DeepSeek, and every day it seems to be doing surprising things. How do you think India feels about that? Is it looking at a kind of future where it's going to be having its own trade wars with China and own trade kind of fights, or is this a benefit for it in giving it a market or a kind of supplier that it might not have had before?
No, I think in technological terms, you're currently dealing with a two-horse race, to put it crudely. I'm not a technologist. I try to follow developments in the New Scientist and the Economist and so on. And it's very clear that in almost all of the core areas of technological competition, in terms of chip development, AI, quantum, China is either now at rough parity or not very far behind, and India isn't seriously competing in any of those areas. What the Indians are doing, which is really quite smart, is they're taking the view that there's absolutely no point trying to produce an Indian DeepSeek. I mean, they're so far behind in that. So what they're doing is they are now the biggest consumer, I think, of AI applications, and using applications to can raise productivity throughout the whole economy. And what India has been brilliant at is digitization. They now have this digital grid, this Aadhaar system, which all Indians are now connected to, for identification, for disbursements of small amounts of money, and there were other elementary welfare system, for commercial transactions, identification. Of course, China is even further down the road, but they are technologically very sophisticated, but they're not trying to compete in terms of what you could call the upstream aspects of technology. I mean, there is a fab that is being considered. I don't think it's actually being built yet, but they're not really trying to compete as a manufacturer of the lowest nanometer chips, for example. I mean, that's essentially being left to the United States and China.
So if you look at their kind of comparative advantages in terms of governance, what role do you think the fact that India is the world's biggest democracy and China is one of the last countries with a kind of communist party still having a monopoly on power, what kind of role do you think that plays in giving them competitive advantage or not in the future? Because obviously for China, its governance model has many issues, but it's been able to build this vast infrastructure over the last 30 or 40 years. Mm-hmm. But obviously for India, I guess it gives it kind of more, sort of openness, more ability to be flexible in terms of engaging with the outside world. It's got a better image, I mean, because of its being an ally of the political West in some areas, not all, but some areas. So how do you that's the big difference between them. I mean, how significant, how do you kind of make sense of that and try and interpret that?
Well, one of the main arguments in my book is that actually they're not all that different. I know we have this, it makes for kind of neat ideological thinking to say, autocracy on one side and democracy on the other, but actually, I have a chapter devoted to this, and one of my arguments is that there's a great deal of overlap, actually, in terms of governance, probably more than we or the Indians particularly would be comfortable with, but it's determined to a significant extent by size and also by their history. I mean, India also, like China, evolved through a system of 5-year planning. Nehru was a great supporter of what was happening in the Soviet Union. It rapidly became very ineffective, and India liberalized in the early 1990s with Manmohan Singh, about a decade after Deng Xiaoping and his reform and opening up. But they were both starting from having very dirigiste controlled economies and then trying to liberalize. And the point I make in the book is that both of them are actually very good examples of state capitalism. The Chinese hate to have their system called state capitalism. Well, it's socialism with Chinese characteristics, but that's essentially what it is. It's a 50-50 economy, half private, half public, roughly, in terms of the turnover of publicly and privately owned institutions. They both have a vast, small-scale private sector in agriculture and commerce. They both have state-dominated financial institutions, nationalized banks. Of course, in China's case, this vast ecosystem of state-owned but very, very effective venture capital companies. And India's got a not dissimilar kind of structure. And both are trying to liberalize. The Deng model still survives despite a sort of reassertion of centralized power. I think the second point of similarity is, of course, we think of China as a completely centralized, everything's run by the chairman, but actually it isn't. China in economic decision making is a pretty decentralized place. An enormous amount of discretion is there to the mayors of towns and districts and at the level of provinces. And the Indians, simply because of the scale of the country, have had to decentralize to become a federation. So you have, simply because of necessity, had to develop decentralized systems of government, and China probably more than India in many ways. And there are other similarities. I mean, the obsession in both countries with territorial integrity. I mean, this concept of, they both potentially have very powerful centrifugal forces from, local secessionist movements. The Indians have the same. They don't get quite as much stick as the Chinese get, but Kashmir, Khalistan, and these are and the central authorities are very tough in dealing with anything that is secessionist, which is actually why India and China are very comfortable as members of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, where essentially those two countries, Russia, the Stans of Central Asia, also Pakistan, they make common cause. They do not want terrorist secessionist movements, and they're quite brutal in dealing with them. So if you can go through a whole list of factors in their governance. I mean, I would also rather provocatively say they don't have a wholly dissimilar approach to dissent. The Modi regime particularly has been cracking down quite hard on NGOs who threaten what they would regard as the integrity of the state. Researchers based in Hong Kong and elsewhere, that there is an enormous amount of dissent going on in China, local strikes, actions against local administrations, in which the party often co-opts. So you have escape valves in both countries, and the idea that China is just some monolithic place where nobody's allowed to do anything different, and that China is some loose, easygoing system is completely false. And I think the final point of similarity, and again, you know this better than I do, Kerry, but I think there is this striving to have a common ideology. After all, you've got a country of 1.4 billion, compare that to UK and the way we agonise about what it is to be British. And if you've got a country of 1.4 billion, how do you create a common ideology, set of beliefs that makes people feel they're part of the same entity, right? And in China, you know the story, you've written about it, and Xi Jinping thought it's supposed to be a kind of unifying set of ideas. And the Indians have now evolved, more controversially, this concept of Hindutva, which isn't much fun if you're one of the 14% or so of Muslims and Christians, but it's the idea, as in China, that there's a deep civilization going back hundreds, if not thousands of years, source of greatness, of great scientific discovery in the past, a common heritage based on civilization. And these two things actually overlap very considerably.
So in the last point, you kind of mentioned the issue of culture. And I suppose this is something that looms over us all, the sort of meaning of culture. And when you look at China and India, I guess they're going through periods of, well, some people say nationalism, but I suppose you could say that they're sort of intensely proud of their culture and their identity. This is a significant moment. They're both becoming economically stronger. You look at those two very different sorts of cultural identity and pride. Is Asia big enough to accommodate these very, very different kind of cultural, sort of presences, cultural forces, basically, because they are very different, and yet they are extremely potent within their own territories?
Yes, I don't know whether it was you who coined the phrase, but civilization state, I think, is a good way of...
That was Martin Jakes.
Sorry, I shouldn't
It's true, no, it's an idea that he came up with, yeah.
Yeah, but it's quite a meaningful concept, I think, and it applies in both cases. I don't think in either, more controversial, I'll say this about China, but they're not trying to conquer the world, this is not... there's lots of bad things happening in China, and some quite aggressive things that are done and said, but it's not quite like Japan in the 1930s, that they obviously want to exercise control over their periphery, but not much further than that, I would think. There is a lot of competition for influence in countries between the two. Bangladesh is to some extent a sort of battleground of competing influence with arms sales, political influence, economics. Sri Lanka is another, Maldives is another. Nepal certainly, Bhutan. I mean, these are areas where constant sort of interplay, but Myanmar, another, very direct influence. So there is a lot of contest going on between Chinese and Indian influence, and I think in almost all the countries I've mentioned, China appears to have a stronger position commercially and politically. But, and I suppose if you're thinking really far ahead, as I try to do in the latter part of my book, to what the world looks like in 25 years' time, you do have to ask this question which you've asked, is can two superpowers, arguably then the two biggest economies in the world, coexist peacefully? And then you go back to the questions I raised right at the beginning about having a common disputed frontier, and the fact that you have this very dangerous triangular set of relationships between Pakistan, China and India, all of which are nuclear powers, and which intentionally or unintentionally could drag each other into something very nasty. And if you were looking at danger spots for a potential nuclear conflict, you'd have to include the Himalayas as an obvious point.
I mean, you've travelled a lot in China, both as a kind of a minister, but also separately. You've travelled a lot in India, and the two places well. Do they understand each other?
No, absolutely not. I mean, one of the things that, well, it's almost amusing, really, is when I've just come back from a visit to China, and I put up my slides, which showed a world in which China and India become dominant economic powers, and the Chinese just couldn't get their heads around it. How can this chaotic, dirty place, ever become a major economic power? They just couldn't understand it. And I used to sort of chide them. I said, well, look, if you're serious about China's role in the world in future, you really need to take the Indians more seriously. And they found that very, very difficult to get their heads around. I think in India's case, it's more neglect than deliberate mindset. But there are a handful of people in Delhi, Ashoka University, a few other places, who know something about China. There's the High Commissioner in London is a Chinese speaker who's been ambassador, and there are a few others who are very, very knowledgeable about China, but they're tiny numbers. And so the capacity for misunderstanding is quite considerable.
Because I understand it, I mean, not a huge number of Chinese visit India. I mean, it's not a sort of place where you get big numbers of tourists or visitors or business people, and it's the same from India to China. I mean, it's probably more Chinese coming to Europe, but at some point, presumably, that will be a problem. I mean, that lack of knowledge maybe will be a kind of issue. Because at the moment it seems to be just, well, we don't need to understand this place. But I mean, India's obviously, as you show in your book, becoming far more of an important economic force.
I mean, the way you do get some opening up is through business. There are a lot of Chinese business people who see a lot of potential in India. Why wouldn't they? I've talked to some of them, who operate there, and they find it difficult to do business in India, but they do, and they make money. What is inhibiting it at the moment is that the Indians have got quite severe restrictions on Chinese business activity. TikTok is banned, Huawei is banned. There are all kind of sanctions on companies which invest near the frontier area, for example. So I think as a result of the last skirmish on the frontier and a general kind of nationalistic suspicion about China, there are enormous restrictions on Chinese business. And one of the things that has relaxed in the last 6 months, and partly goes back to the conversation we had about India's reaction to American crassness, is that the Indians have begun to open up a bit.
I'll open it up to questions in a second, and I think there's going to be a roving microphone somewhere. But I guess the final thing is, and I mean, you kind of touch on it partly in the book, but from sitting, I mean, obviously this was sort of drafted and written, you know, kind of maybe a year ago. So from today, if you sort of sit and you look at the situation the Chinese economy is in today, you say you've just, you know, been to China. It's obviously going through some turbulence with the housing market, youth unemployment, you know, all these issues. India's also kind of hitting some issues because of its fight with the United States. If you kind of think 25 years, who would you put your money on to kind of really be the ultimate kind of economic winner? I mean, do you think that the governance of India is going to be the thing, the rule of law and, you know, the openness, or do you think that China's kind of very controlled form of socialist sort of capitalism, is this going to be the thing that prevails?
Well, I suppose that's the big question which runs throughout my book. I mean, if you start from where we are at the moment, the Indian economy is the fastest growing of any major country in the world, has been for some years.
7%, right? Is it 7%?
Yeah, it's about 6 or 7%. And it was almost double digits the early part of the last decade. Even when it was crippled by all these controls and restrictions of the permit Raj, it was still growing about 5%, right? So even when India's doing badly, it has this capacity to produce substantial economic growth. And you'd have to ask, you know, why isn't their growth the same as China's was when it was the same as state of development, or Korea for that matter? You know, China had 3+ decades of almost 10% growth. Why isn't India doing the same? So, you know, they're going to continue to grow at quite a formidable rate, even if they don't do particularly well. And, you know, compound interest is a very powerful thing. And that's what produces this doubling and quadrupling and so on over time. So I think you have to assume that the Indian economy is going to be a very big elephant somewhere in the world economy. And there aren't all that many things that can derail it. I mean, there are things that inhibit it, you know, including, you know, bad policy, but not too many things that could derail it. Whereas in China's case, there are two big problems. I gave a lecture at Shenzhen University a few weeks ago, and I had a slide where I described the Chinese economic problem as a combination of a crisis of capitalism and a crisis of communism. And I asked my host, I said, do you really want me to put this slide up? You know, is nobody going to object? No, shouldn't. Let's have a good discussion. And we did, and it was quite an animated discussion, because I think there's understanding, even amongst, you know, loyal party people, that they've got economic difficulties. And the crisis of capitalism is the collapse of a massive property boom, which 25-30% of the economy. They have a problem we would dream about in Britain of having too many houses and falling house prices, but it has a significant effect which economists will recognize of a wealth effect, that if you wipe out wealth, it has a knock-on effect on consumption, which is what's happened. Demand is very weak, prices are falling, deflation, doesn't happen very often in economics. And added to that, there's some of you may be familiar with the writings of Michael Pettis, who argues that China is a little bit like the 19th century Britain that Marx and Engels wrote about, where workers' wages are being squeezed to create profit, to invest. And it's a high investment economy, and it's achieved by squeezing wages. And so Chinese workers don't have the purchasing power that they should have. So those two elements make up the criticism that China has a crisis of capitalism. The crisis of communism is a different point. I mean, quite a few people like George Magnus and others have been arguing over the years that China's got this growing problem of throwing massive amounts of investment into the economy, but with reduced results, you know, diminishing returns to scale. Economists have this phrase I call incremental capital output ratio, and China is becoming a much more capital-intensive economy with reduced returns to investment. And the planning system clearly is part of that. It may well target important technologies, but staggering amounts of money is wasted, and you have an infrastructure where you're beginning to get roads to nowhere and the kind of thing that they experienced in Japan. So you can tell a negative story about China, and it's compounded now by demographics, declining population, declining labour force potentially, which they're trying to counter through robotics and liberalising the hukou system and so on. But these are all big problems. But when I'm asked, when I feel like, I read about this a lot in US journals, and you feel a lot of Western commentators are almost sort of egging the Chinese on to fail. But they actually usually manage to find answers, and there is a radical process of dealing with the crisis of capitalism. They are pumping vast amounts of monetary and fiscal stimulus into the country, and it does appear to be slowly working. Their crisis of communism is perhaps overstated because all these state-owned venture capital companies are actually very smart, and they're not stupid. It's not kind of Soviet-style planning. It's much, much more sophisticated and efficient. So on the basis of past experience, I would guess that the Chinese economy is probably going to continue to grow significantly faster than the Western world. And it's now about 4.5–5%, assuming you believe Chinese figures, which some people are skeptical about. And I don't see that as being unsustainable. So if you've got India growing at 7 or 8%, China growing at 4 or 5%, the United States 2 to 3%, Europe at 1%, over a long period of time, you can see what the outlook is. And that, in a way, is the story of my book, which I started with the past, which is at the end of the Cold War, the Western world had about 60% of the world economy. It's now down to almost about 40%. And the emerging and developing economies led by China and now India has been filling that gap. And I find it very difficult to see circumstances in which that trend is reversed.
Great. If I can open it up, anyone has a question, and I can. The gentleman at the back, I think you'll bring a mic down. So the gentleman just put his hand up first, just in front of the camera. Just coming around to you. Yeah. And if you could sort of say your name and who you are, and then ask
my name's William Bates. I work for the FCA. That's not why I'm here. So my question is, when it comes to sort of the Chinese and Indian economies, while they both have sort of growing economies and growing sort of, certainly India sort of growing interest in their manufacturing sectors, I was visiting China recently, and yes, they've got these sort of Gautier high-speed trains to nowhere. But what struck me is the infrastructure and the sort of speed of logistics in China is so much higher than in India. You can overnight something from southern China to northern China for a pittance. And I think the challenges with sort of moving manufacturing to India is almost the Indian logistics system seems to me to be very regionalised, very slow. So I think I don't quite see how India's going to move up that value chain of manufacturing until they fix that problem. What's your view on that?
Well, you're right. I mean, the Chinese infrastructure is stunning. I mean, I go always with a slight skepticism about what is now happening with the rail system, the road system, the airports, and of course digital infrastructure is out of this world and in many ways way ahead of us. So but I think your question is more about the Indian system. I mean, I first went to India in the 60s. I've been going back regularly for business, family, political reasons, and over the 60 years. And the transformation is remarkable, actually. And India now has a much more sophisticated, well-developed road, rail, airport, that kind of basic ports, basic physical things now work in a way that they didn't. Telecommunications. The electricity grid is now much more reliable. And there are all kind of horror stories. I mean, you get them all the time, but actually a vast amount of infrastructure investment has taken place and is taking place. I mean, there's an ugly side to it. I mean, the big infrastructure boom in India is led by Adani, the oligarch, and that sort of points to both corruption and inequalities of wealth and power. But there are these guys who are driving infrastructure development very, 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 very fast.
Isabel, I think, yes, Isabel. If the mic can come down to the third row up here. Yeah, just the third row. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Very interesting conversation. I sympathise with your discovering that Chinese officials didn't really think that India would ever amount to much. I used to find they thought India was a rather convincing argument against democracy. But if it were to be the case that India's economy could follow the path that you outline, I wonder how comfortable China would actually be with that. And we've seen, one description of China today is that it's a techno-authoritarian state which uses its dominance of technologies for other purposes, which you can see in the confrontation with the US. Don't you think there's at least a possibility that it would find the idea of a serious challenge across the board from India uncomfortable enough to attempt to slow it down, just as the United States has been trying to do with China?
Yes, there's a lot in what you say, I think. India is not exactly a global player, but I think in areas where it's trying to compete with China in terms of influence, as it is now in Africa, the Indians have now got their own version of the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think quite a lot of African countries prefer it because it's less intrusive and less threatening. And just more level. I also think and I think you probably know much more about this than I do, certainly, and Kerry too. But I don't think the Chinese political structure, as it now is under Xi Jinping, is sort of given forever. I mean, we know there's going to be a big discontinuity when he goes, however he goes. We also know that a decade ago, China was experimenting with all kind of more subtle forms, I wouldn't say democracy, but contested election at a sort of local level and more debate within the party was beginning to happen. There's no reason why that shouldn't come back. I mean, some of the kind of Chinese intellectuals I talk to, and I sort of try to tease out of them, where do you think your system is going eventually? And I think what they would really want to see is a kind of giant Singapore, right? Where you have an element of competition, but one party always wins. Where you have a high level of discipline, openness, people free to come and go. A country that everybody admires. And I sense that although currently there is a high level of stasis because of the current chairman, at some point they're going to go back to that unfinished political agenda. And I think one of the interesting areas of questioning is how China could begin to unravel some of the the rigidities in the system, and that will probably happen, I would guess. And competition with the Indian model may well be a catalyst to help that along.
That's an interesting point, because I guess a lot of kind of effort goes into thinking, as you said, about the China's economy kind of being, basically imploding and having big problems. But I don't think anyone's ever really thought through what would an incredibly successful Chinese model of capitalism look like. Because I get the sense that the alt-right in America, they quite admire the lack of labor rights, the kind of incredible rawness of Chinese capitalism, right? It's completely, no social welfare. I mean, Xi Jinping sort of said he doesn't want, kind of having social welfare. I mean, really, it's kind of a very, very right-wing model. So, I mean, that would be very, very competitive. I think a world with Chinese capitalism unbridled by, any sort of restraints from communism would be quite a thing,
Yes, I remember a conversation I had when I was Secretary of State, visiting the party secretary, I think in Guangdong. A very smart, sophisticated guy, and I was being prodded by people on my side to talk about human rights, and I thought a better way of doing it was to get in on labour rights, actually. I said, and I think my question was something on the lines of, you're a socialist country, and I don't see much evidence of this in the labour market. I come from a wicked capitalist country, and we have things like minimum wage and labour protection. Please explain. and the guy was up for a good argument, actually. He was in private, so that they could say what he liked. And it was basically, of course, we're at the stage of development that early capitalism was in the West, and it's, we had to do things that way, and it is a bit rough. But as we develop, we will develop institutions like yours. So, by the way, will you please send me information you have on the British minimum wage system, and we'll see whether we can make any use of it. So I think that kind of questioning is bound to open up as they get to full employment and labour shortage.
Yet to be implemented, Chinese minimum wage yet to be implemented. I think there was a question, there, and then Ninel. So a couple, so the gentleman there, and then Ninel, So just,
Thanks, Carrie.
Yeah, you got a, sorry, she's just coming. Yeah,
sorry.
Go for it.
Sorry, my name's Henry Tillman. I know both you guys. Sorry, I met you both before. I want to take this. You wrote this a year ago, so life has moved on since then. So in '98, Primakov wrote that someday RIC would come together. It's called Primakov's Triangle. If you look at the numbers from '99, when he first said this, in 2002, SEO started, right? So that became your, if you started Eurasia. In 2006, were BRICS, right? So you wrote on that. So arguably, in September this year, Primakov's Triangle involving Eurasia has been launched. And I'm a specialist in nuclear power, safe nuclear. And so what you find among all three already, the world's greatest supply of safe energy is thorium. It's in India. So India is already working with Russia, which is the world leader in safe nuclear, and with China already, how this is all linking. So, and ultimately, those three countries will lead the world in safe nuclear power. And so Primakov's Triangle actually works now. It wasn't just a concept from 1998. They made it happen, and they're all working together. So the theory of one the other is not what this is about. It's how to leverage each other's technology to then power the world with safe energy. Thank you. Comments, please.
And then,
well, you've hit on a subject I don't know a great deal about. I will. My observation, though, that is it not the case that I think 2/3 to 3/4 of all new nuclear reactors are in China?
On the large cap, not the SMRs.
The larger reactors, yes. And I presume they're safe because China, as far as I know, hasn't had a nuclear disaster in its civil nuclear industry. Whether they're collaborating with the Russians, certainly the Indians have an ambitious nuclear program as well. So what you say does make sense, actually. I think in many ways, the Indians and the Chinese would much prefer their renewable energy to come from, wind and solar. I mean, there's hardly a shortage of sun in either country. Plenty of wind in China. It's become the marginal cost is almost zero. So if you want the renewable power sector, you're likely to use those technologies, I would thought, rather than become over-reliant on nuclear. But your question also makes a point which I overlooked, which is the importance that the Indians still attach to the relation with Russia. And this, of course, is what's got them into trouble with the Trump administration. But that triangular relationship, it's an interesting idea. Maybe a PhD from that from somebody. Yeah.
Mimel, yeah.
Ninel Sinyuk. We know China and India are both BRICS members. China, as we can see from data, is a driving force from investment and trade perspective. What about the role of India in BRICS, and what is your vision of India's role in BRICS,
The BRICS
development? Yeah,
that's about it. Yeah, well, India and China were the sort of core original members. I mean, I think, to be brutally frank, it's largely, almost entirely a talking shop. It's done they have a bank based in China, but not a great deal else. I mean, the one major area where the BRICS are important is acting as a catalyst for de-dollarization, which is why the Trump administration is so hostile. And, you know, Brazil is very much part of all this, as well as China and India. India's role in it is interesting. A year ago when I was there, the Indian authorities were at great pains to point out they weren't dumping the dollar, and they were perfectly happy to have their trade denominated in dollars. They've now changed tack, and they're very much in the same position as the Chinese, that they're seriously worried about getting entangled in American secondary sanctions. And so the best way to safeguard their position is to get as much as possible of their trade ideally in rupees, which, you know, there is quite a bit of trade with the United Emirates as well as Russia in rupees, but certainly diversifying. And I haven't followed this too closely, but there's a very important experiment taking place through the bridge transaction system. I don't know whether anybody has been following this, but it was a scheme that was set up originally between Thailand, China, and the United Emirates. It's an odd combination, with the backing of the Bank of International Settlements, which didn't realize, I think, that they were being drawn into some geopolitical play. And it was to find a way of enabling much easier transactions, bypassing dollars as a counterparty. And my understanding is that Chinese are now developing the software for this system, and that it's beginning to work, and it's giving the leading BRICS country an opportunity to trade bypassing the dollar. And that's over and above all the stuff that's going on in central banks, where dollars are being offloaded, partly for hedging reasons, partly for political reasons. So that is actually a very big story, because one of the few ways in which the US is unambiguously the hegemon is in money and the use of the dollar. And China and India and Brazil are gnawing away at that.
Austin, so yeah, just if you bring that just over this side. The gentleman there.
Hi, sorry I haven't had a chance to read your book as yet, but it's on my reading list. I just wanted to ask a couple of things. First of all, it's interesting when you started by saying that you didn't want to use the word enemy in relation to India and China, and of course enemy has taken on an entirely new meaning in relation to the UK and China in the last couple of weeks. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. But in general, when you say that China, India, and the forging of a new world, I was wondering whether there was a kind of a typographical error and it should have said New World Order. I just wonder what your thoughts are on this kind of forging of as people have mentioned, whether it's BRICS or whether it's just India and China, whether there is a shift in the political world away from the West towards the East. Because I interviewed Martin Wolf many years ago, probably at the time of the 2008 recession, and there was a little bit of a compromised idea on his part that capitalism would survive even if it moved away from the UK. So the West may shrink and die, but at least capitalism would thrive in the new markets of the East. So I wondered what your thoughts are on that in general, please.
Well, on the latter point, I think we partly covered it. I mean, China, whatever language you use, is a very capitalist country, and so is India, alongside a very powerful state. So those two things are there. Sorry, the first part was...
Enemies.
Yeah. Yeah, the UK, I'm sure quite a few people wanted to get us back to what's happening. I thought that kerfuffle last week was just a bit amateur theatricals. I'm sorry, I mean, I'm no longer in government. I mean, I'm no longer an MP, or I'm no longer in Parliament. I have no idea what they're up to. But the bottom line was that the espionage that was achieved through these two young men, as I understand it, was that the Chinese were told stuff that was totally unclassified and which they could have read about in the morning paper in the UK. So, you know, if that's spying, somebody's not very good at it. I mean, I can imagine that the Chinese might want to know what's in British submarines that are going to AUKUS and things of that kind. And no doubt they have people making inquiries about it. But what was happening last week was really silly and not serious. And my only thought about it was that it was basically covering up something else that was more serious. There is, of course, a big argument going on in the background about embassies, where the British want to replace their embassy in Beijing, and the Chinese want a big new embassy here. And that's, I don't think that's about snooping, it may be, but it's partly about prestige and aggrandizement and big buildings, I suspect. But I think probably deep down, what is probably happening is that quite a lot of pressure is being exerted on the British establishment, I use that word loosely, from our friends in America saying, look, you know, you've really got to choose. You can't fool around with friendly relations with China. And constant pressure exerted through, maybe through the, you know, people in the public services, but you know, Conservative MPs, that group who are constantly trying to raise the temperature, raise scare stories. I mean, my answer is a fairly bland one. It goes back to my days in business, that you go to China and there are threats and there are opportunities. Just saying it is a threat, it's basically a silly reaction. I mean, there are threats, of course there are, and there are opportunities, of course there are, and there are common areas of interest around climate and, you know, we're on the same planet. So you have to work with them. And you have to engage, to use a fashionable phrase, and that's the kind of realistic position. It's, you know, it's supping, but supping with a long spoon seems to be the only sensible approach we should adopt to China.
Thank you very much. So the book will be available over here. I think it's £20, is that right? Inscribed, if you can get hold of him, with Vince's signature. Thank you very much. It's great to discuss with you. I think you're the first participant in China Week. That was a finalist on Strictly Come Dancing, right?
I wasn't a finalist. I did the Christmas edition, which is a much less prestigious event. But I did get a 10 from Craig Revel Hall.
Right, so the only person to get a 10 as a kind of ballroom dancing. But it's a really important subject, and this is one of the few, well, probably the most current and kind of comprehensive comparison. So it's really important to understand this relationship. So I highly recommend it. Thank you very much. It's great to have you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.